Welcome back. We look forward continuing in chapter Ches. We began this chapter, I believe it was 2 lessons ago. We're holding on page 170, I believe it's 7 lines from the top. Ki hamayla madrega rishona. And the reason I mentioned that we began this chapter is because one could appreciate the message of this Pedic, of this chapter, simply by a click away. We mentioned time again that it's not fair to take important time of the present class and to review, at least in detail. Yes, sometimes just a quick entry, but not really to take that much time to elaborate, even though this is key. Dr. begins this chapter, Ki Hamaila is coming from what he said before, but it's a click away, especially today's technology. You need not to wait. Just right under this class, in other words, all the previous classes of this segment, Shari Chamona, for that matter, we mentioned, we had the merit to include also Lakuti Amorim. We have all the classes of Lakuti Amorim, but focusing on Shari Chamona, this very class, this very message of Perik Ches, is just the previous class and the class before. And it's worthwhile because what a tremendous, tremendous message Perik Ches as presents over here as a follow-up of Perik Zayin, the infamous Perik Zayin, if you will. I don't think we ever had a class, so many classes on one chapter. It's simply because Alter Rebbe, once he brought it home, that unique message of Daled, Hey, Vav, once he came there in Perik Zayin, he just like is able to clarify so many subjects in Yiddishkeit, particularly associated with Hashem Echad, which was the controversy in many Gdei Yisrael of all times. For example, the idea of Tzimtzum Kipshutei, Tzimtzum not Kipshutei. And once the Alter Rebbe opened up this message of Hashem Echad, he was able to clarify a number of subjects, as such as Perik Zayin is a very elaborative Perik. As we use the expression Shar Yich V'Emunah, the Alter Rebbe brings us into this gate of oneness and faith, oneness, unity, and faith. As we mentioned so many times, entering this gate, one enters in the gate, they'll inevitably never come out the same. One comes out a revolutionary change, with a revolutionary change in their whole appreciation of Hashem Echad. It's a metamorphosis approach to this message, not only a declaration, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Pamayim B'chol Yom, but much, much more than that. We say it even more than twice a day. In the end of the day, we say it again, the Shema Yisrael. But it's not only a demonstration and a declaration, but it becomes something which the message becomes extremely clear and transparent and tangible in the different levels of Hashem Echad. Like Dr. Rebbe explains himself, the Yichud Itato and Yichud Ilah, the supreme oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, pretty much the ability to look at matters the way through Hashem's lens. Generally through the way that the Achdus Hashem is milmailo of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, from the Kadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, Einid Milvada, the Lashon of Alter Rebbe Bitul B'Mitzias, and a complete nullification of the entire reality, because everything is really part of that Hashem Echad. But again, important messages in throughout Shari Yichud Memuna, and as Alter Rebbe brings it home in Perik Vav, and namely in Perik Zayin. And from there, the Alter Rebbe goes on in Perik Ches. He extends this, he explains even more the idea of the oneness within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way the way Hashem functions, or as Lashon of the Alter Rebbe, everything we know about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because these are truly the midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the titles, the Nevi'im, ascribed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not that Hashem taps into them. He is removed, but then he puts on the cap of Chesed, Rachmim, and so on, and then he expresses himself through them. But the message is, no, that's who he is, based on the famous Rambam, Hu V'daite. In the end of the day, Hashem, His das, and everything, He knows it's truly one, based on the famous proof of the Rambam elucidated by the Alter Rebbe in the previous chapters. Then in the end of the day, it's all one. So if it's all one at that level of das, it's all one in every single midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We did point out, and from everything, from all the midas, which is the one the Alter Rebbe elaborated on, something which every Yid constantly needs, that encouragement for so many reasons. We spoke about it then. We mentioned it from the same famous word, V'hosir sotim milfonenu mi'acharenu. We mentioned this in the past, that it's the disbelief that the Eibishter really wants us at all times, but and the Rebbe has like 2.5 lines, particularly pointed out this midah even more than any other midah, and which in generally it's encouraging information. But more than that, Al Rebbe is saying that's who Hashem is. Hashem is the Reitzeh, as Hashem is Yireh. The Eibishter is the Chafetz Chesed. The Reitzeh b'Shavasam Shirashayim Ein Chafetz Nisasam B'Rishasam Uteheri Naim Mereis Bera. Again, not to go into it now. We spent quite some time explaining this. That's who He is. The whole Eibishter is the Teheri Naim Mereis Bera. Again, I read these lines. Interesting, important. I feel compelled again to point this out. That from all the midas, this is what the Alter Rebbe chose such an encouraging message on in general, but with the Alter Rebbe's information over here brings intensifies that encouragement to such a total different level. It's not that Eivish Hashem puts on the cap of Reichim, the Chuvasam, and Teheri Naim, but that's who He is. That's who He is. The whole Eivish is that Teheri Naim. Again, we pointed this out. We just mentioned we shouldn't take time to explain or to go back to the previous classes. Let's see how I follow. But again, it's just a click away on. Now, wherever you see this, the class, you can always find the previous classes. But on the original website, it's just simply easier because as it's everything is set up in a way just it's simply easy to follow, and you'll see the link on wherever you see the class it's the Tanya online, one word, tanyaonline.com website, which you'd see this class and all the previous classes, which is set up in the same exact fashion, a separate scroll bar for the text, with the text, in order to be able to easily follow the class as you follow the text. So these previous classes on Perek Ches is just right there. Click away. So we're going to begin. Ki hamayla madrega rishena. It's an Ivrayim Yachachma. So I'll tell you contrasts over here to the last, very very last class. Contrasts. I think the way the way it exists by Hashem, the way in contrast the way it exists by the human being, and this is what we usually appreciate. We appreciate things the way they reflect by us as human beings. And for that matter, the Alter Rebbe himself says in Peri Gimel in Shayich in Kuti Amarim, excuse me, the reason why everything is established by the human being, and particularly the Yid, is because Nishtal Shalom Mehen, everything evolves from the way it's on high. And if we have the 10 midas, the 10 svidas, the 3 divided, compartmentalized, the cognitive faculties and the emotional faculties, it's just because that's the way it is on high. As we can appreciate and understand it on our own, but we hear this is Alter Rebbe says in the very beginning, just in a few words, in Perek Gimel, the reason why it exists by the Yid is because Nishtal Shalom Mehen. It evolves from the way it's on high. So one would suggest that if I want to know exactly the way things are on high with Hashem, just look at the way it is by myself. And Alter Rebbe here negates that very clearly and emphatically, saying that yes, everything, the way your setup is pretty much a evolvement of the way it's on high, but make no mistake that on high works exactly the same way that your system works. It's not so. That says, yeah, you have machshava, I have machshava, but it doesn't work the same. How could we think even for a moment that it should exactly work the same? Even Nishtal Shalom, because the Eibush is the Beire, we are part of creation, and we could never think that Creator has the same rules as creation. For that matter, Hashem created these rules. We even mentioned the other day, if you recall, I believe it was even last class, that these rules, which are so sensible to us, and they truly make sense, and they are so within the rules and parameters of creation, but that itself was created. We give the example, 10 plus 10 is 20. Yeah, it's true, it's an absolute fact, but nonetheless, it was created. this phenomenon was created, all reason, rationale, was part of the dynamic and phenomenon of creation. Before creation, could have been 10 plus 10 equals 30. Could be the question, what does it mean that 10 plus 10? Maybe that didn't exist as well before creation, but conceptually thinking, let's say there was something like 10 plus 10, it could have been 30. We don't understand it because that rationale itself was created on the 6 days of creation, like anything else was created. Time, space, reason, and so on. So we should never believe that whatever the way our system functions and unfolds, that's the way it is on high. No, not at all. And here the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing this towards the end of this chapter. Zion, he elaborates how the way it works by the human being. And Perek Tes, if you want to give a little glimpse on Perek Tes, if you have the original text in front of you, or any way you're following, the Perek Tes begins, Avol Gabi HaKodesh Baruch Hu, in contrast to Hashem, it works it's so different. And here the Alter Rebbe says something different. Not only so different, he points out, he starts with a certain order and saying that by Hashem, what is the highest, by the human being, by Hashem is the lowest. And then he says, yeah, it's much more than these levels, organized levels that I'm going to present to you in Perek Ches. It's beyond that. Ribu Ribavis in Lashon Alter Rebbe Adin Ketza, we can understand it. It's not only 5 levels when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're talking about something in a total different plane, a total different level. But Alter Rebbe begins, and again, the very organized 5 steps exist within the human being, the beginning and the end, and he says, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the beginning and the rashis, the way it is by human being, is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the end. Kulam b'chachma sisa, and he says, by the beginning of the human being, there's the rashis, the beginning of the function, which, as we all know, is our cognitive faculties, and within our cognitive faculties as well, it's the chachma, right? Chachma bin adas. We explained this a number of times. Chachma is the original entry as an insight which would eventually be developed with our bina and expanded on, and eventually the function of das, which is a separate faculty, as the Alter Rebbe speaks about this in the 3rd chapter of Likutei Amorim, V'hadas, and the uniqueness and the distinct expression of das, even different and distinct than the Chachma Bina, not to go into it now. And then our emotions are triggered, and then from there our thought, our speech, and action, which these are the 5 levels, Chabad, Midas, and then Machshava, Dibur, Maisa, which are categorized as levushim, garments. Again, that you can see also, Likutei Amorim, the next chapter, the Perek Daled, Va'oid yesh l'nefesh has 3 levushim, garments, and explains there why are these called garments as opposed to the neshama itself, and for that matter, the virtue of this being the garments of the neshama. In other words, the virtue of the garments rather over the neshama itself. This is the famous Perek Daled, elaborated on in Perek Lamed Hey in Tanya, which speaks about the essentiality of connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu precisely through our garments, by learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, which can only be implemented and realized, actualized through our garments, through our machshava dibur u'maisa, and that has, in the end of the day, a greater virtue, this expression of Yid's connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu precisely through his garments, which is the only way a person could learn Torah and do mitzvahs, like explained in Perek Daled, a greater virtue over the experience of the neshama itself. So there's the machshava dibur u'maisa, and he explains what is. We also took the time to explain the difference of a lavush, the garment, and something which is part of the person or part of the system, and then the garment of that, which there is different advantages of the garment additional to what the Alter Rebbe speaks about there, or the fact that because it's just a garment, it's so easy to change, and so on. Again, we spoke about it then, but which is not part of the message over here, other than the fact that Alter Rebbe points out that there's the machshava, the dibur, the maisa, which comes following the midas, following the Chabad, and within the Chabad itself, reishis chachma, for that matter, reishis chachma is Hashem, right? That's what it says in the pasuk. Alter Rebbe many times takes these pasukim. There's the reishis chachma. Pause. At the beginning of everything is chachma. Is something we can appreciate. The beginning of all our system as human beings is the chachma. The reishis chachma. And you see even in the way with the Alter Rebbe, not to jump the gun over here, but just the way the Alter Rebbe teaches a pasuk, and so obviously he always brings in, he always introduces the way things are. Rather, there's the simple meaning of the pasuk, and the way the Alter Rebbe teaches the pasuk, as the author of Chassidus Chabad, which was everything. The Alter Rebbe always found the significance of the fusion of every part of Torah. Pshat, Remesh, Drush, Soid, one is not exclusive to the other. Understandably, when you touch Reishis Chachma, Reishis Chachma, you're not excluding the other part of the pasuk, Reishis Chachma, Yiras Hashem. In that context, is Reishis Chachma, Yiras Hashem. That itself, you have to understand why it's Reishis Chachma, Yiras Hashem, why not Reishis Yiras Hashem, which in the ultimately every Pirush in Torah, you would find the interconnection between the different Pirushim, which on the surface seem so distinct and different than the original Pirush, with the original Pirush. This case also, but not to go into it, Reishis Chachma is something we can appreciate, the beginning of everything. Every system is the Chachma, by the human being. And so we say not to jump the gun, the Alter Rebbe speaks about the famous Kulam B'Chachma, see the translation of the Alter Rebbe, Kulam B'Chachma Sisa, that you, the literal translation, you did everything, you established everything with Chochmah. But the Alter Rebbe teaches, Kulam Chochmah Sisa. The Chochmah is like Asiya Gashmis. By you, the highest level, which is Chochmah, and from Chochmah there is, which is the Chochmah, which is the beginning of the Chochmah Bin Das, the cognitive faculties, the Chabad. And then goes Midas, and then goes Machshava, and then goes Dibur, and then goes Ma'aseh, thought, and then speech, and then action. So action is the lowest. Chachma is the highest. By HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kulam B'Chachma Asisa. That by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Chachma, which is to you the greatest, is Asisa, is the fifth level. In other words, which by you is the fifth level, that is the way the Chachma is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Chachma is like an Asiyah Gashmis. It's like an action in comparison to who the Eibishter really is. And obviously the Alter Rebbe is going to make it clear, it's not only 5 level different, that what by us is the beginning, by Hashem is already the end, because Hashem is so much more exalted than that. Kulam B'Chochma Asisa, that the Chochma is like an Asiyah Gashmis, like an action to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is greater than the way it is by a human being, the way things are established by a human being, 5 levels, which is a lot. And it's not only a lot in the numbers of 5 levels. What is the highest by us is the lowest by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in the end of the day, it's a difference of 5 levels. Alter Rebbe makes it clear it's much more than 5 levels. Ribui Revavis, and he says Adin Ketz. There's no comparison. And therefore, again, we can never take our Chochmah and try to say, oh, the way I understand things, that's probably the way the Eibush Hashem understands things. No, when your Chochmah, which is by your Reishis, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's Asiyah, the Eibush has many workings beyond that. As the Rebbe used to say many times, our Rebbe used to say many times, that it's a chidush, it's a novelty when you do understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could a nivra, a created being, understand a bairi, a creator? It doesn't make sense. Again, we're already introducing making sense. It's beyond doesn't make sense. It's just something which is so negated, and again, so clearly brought out in these very chapters of Ches and Tes, Aval, Tes, Aval, Gabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then he goes on, again, not only 5 levels, but infinite amount of levels, and then the workings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu before you would ever enter this Chachma, which is to us the highest level. And this is with the Alter Rebbe, the next part and the end of chapter, till the end of chapter Ches, he speaks about the way it is by the human being. So let's see it inside with the text. The first level by created beings is Chachma. Therefore it's called Reishis. It's the beginning of all the energy which exists within creations. So the first of all, he says, beginning of all the chayas. First of all, that's the beginning of the system. The beginning of the system of the human being is his intellect. That's where he starts. You understand something, you perceive something. And then you have a drive to it, and then you develop it, and you think about it, and you talk about it, and you do, and you have hands on it. Basically, it depends on what context. Sometimes it's compassion. I understand. I perceive a certain scenario which aroused my heart to have compassion on that party, and then I think about it, talk words of compassion, and then action. I actualize it. I do something about it. I go take the piece of bread or the loaf of bread and give it to the individual who I had compassion on, because he was going to his poverty was so calling. So you have so at the beginning it begins my understanding, my perception of the matter. And then my emotions follow suit, are produced, right? Tel this Chabad, as the Alter Rebbe says in that very chapter, Peri Gimel, of Likutei Amorim, that is. But it begins, the Reishis Chabad, the Alter Rebbe says also, even in the system of the system of the human being, the nerve system is in the brain. And that is also the Reishis Chochma, it's the chayis, it's the vitality, it's the energy, which establishes all the other functions of the body. So so you can understand this again. It's a dual message, and one not exclusive to the other, because it's both of them. It's true that it's the chayis, it's the reishis, the way the human being begins his function to move on with everything else, as we just explained. It's also reishis chayis. It's the energy which exists again in the brain, which is the nerve system, beginning with Chochmah. That's really the chayis, which ultimately it develops throughout the entire healthy system of the human being. So back to the text over here. Ki me'achochma nimshachas bina v'das. Ki me'achochma nimshachas bina v'das, because from Chochmah you have the bina and the das develop, as we explained. It starts with a flash, with the initial insight, and then it's elaborated on, it's expanded on, and to have the thorough understanding and appreciation of that matter, and then it enters into das, which is again generally it's becoming close, it's becoming personable with that message, intimate with that message, which that allows it to develop into midas. Alter Rebbe mentions very clearly that you can have a subject you understand thoroughly, but not necessarily it'll produce a midah, not necessarily will it follow with an emotion. It's only because you became very close, you became very connected to that concept, which allows the midas to be produced and to follow. And the Alter Rebbe, again, just mentioned this is a separate part of in the end of the third chapter, V'hadas, in the third chapter in Likutei Amorim, that is, and because Alter Rebbe explains there the uniqueness of that, this final, the third faculty within the cognitive faculties, which is das, even more than Chochmah Bina. So that would be the das, that's why it's called Maftecha de Kol Shis. It's called a key which includes all the 6 midas, because this is what produces the midas. And so there you have the das. And then from there, from there, all the midas of the intellectual nefesh are evolve rather, like love, kindness, compassion, mercy, and similarly. And we see this, we see evidently, we see this by a child which has no knowledge. So you can have Chochmah and Bina, you can understand things quite thorough, but das, the connection, that sharp, that acute connection with the matter, the das, the child doesn't have. That's why child becomes bar mitzvah and he becomes obligated and responsible for the performance of the entire Torah and mitzvahs when they become 13, a girl when they become 12, because then they gain das. They perhaps have the Chochmah Bina, but then they gain the das, that clarity, the acuity, which allows them to appreciate and sense the responsibility towards their Creator, for which they were created for, which is the observance of learning Torah and the observance of mitzvahs. Before that, they can't have a very detailed and understanding of any matter, but the das they don't have. Back to the Peirik, Kod Shem das, usually is Bekas Tommy. Usually there is a certain sense of ongoing anger with the child. Now, it doesn't mean that children are always angry. They're actually quite pleasant, but it's so easy. In other words, it's somewhat kind of almost default for them and just ready to perform to get angry. Someone just says something wrong or does something wrong, and this is stuff which is trivial, petty. They would get angry. And he says even Achzori, constantly. Zari literally means that there's a translation of Zari would be like a sense of cruelty, but that is not trying to paint a image of cruelty in association with children. It means to say like a certain selfishness, indifference. You took it away, and or I don't want to share with you. Sometimes you see even children, which it's difficult for them to part with even a tart, a gift. And even when they're kind by nature and they do it, they always, you see, you can even sometimes identify when they do share. There's something like, something doesn't make sense. It doesn't necessarily click by them because they have a certain sense of selfishness. They see the other party, but not the way an adult can see and appreciate another party. Yet, just to mention, sometimes it's yotzas hefsede bischore, that by a child, how quick does it take to get over an issue? They could be not only in talking terms, but they could go back to the way things were, like you never even sensed. There's not even a mark, not even a reshim that they were just quarreling 12 and a half minutes ago before that. They just come and start playing with each other. And that's also because they don't have no das. By an adult, whoa, something happened over here. And they capture the idea, not only with their chacham bina, with their das. So it's a whole decision to make up, and there's always a mark. And for that matter, from a certain perspective, a point of view, rightfully so, and therefore it's incumbent upon the other party, which established that mark, to get rid of it. And that's the whole idea of apology, and true apology, and a true resolution, to be resolute that you would not repeat it, and the other person has to sense it. There's a whole, play out the way it unfolds by adults as opposed to children. By children, because they don't have a das, so they didn't give much attention to what happened. Yet, yes, they easily get angry, and you certainly see a certain sense of achzariyut by them, a certain indifference, a certain selfishness. But in the end of the day, because there's no das, it works to the positive also. Like what they say, the children would rather be happy than right. By adults is the other way, but that itself is not exactly an accurate statement, because there's no rather by children. They don't have the das, so there's no rather in a decision. It's just the onset. It's not such a big deal for them. At the time it was, because that's the nature of the child. They don't have the das, so they're bekas tummy. They're always a little. They can get easily upset and demonstrate their selfishness so easily because they don't have the das again. But it works the other way as opposed to it is by adults. But going back to the message of the Alter Rebbe, you see how the Chabad are the teldus of the midas, the way your cognitive faculties unfold rather, play out. That's the way your midas play out. By a child, he's constantly bikas and constantly achzari, is because he ain't by das. He doesn't have the das to capture a matter in the unique way that das presents it. Doesn't have that rachvas, that broadness, and therefore it expresses all these bikas tamid v'achzari. So too we find gavam basli dvarim ktanim shenari la'avam, and so too his connection, his love, his drive is to things which are trivial, which are not worthy to love, not worthy to be driven to. And it obviously has so many, it depends sometimes in relative to things which are more significant. Tell a child, here's 5 candies and here's $100 bill. You can buy so many more candies with a $100 bill. Today's day and age, not that more. Many more for sure, but not like it was in the past. Everything changed even with the $100 bill, but definitely you can get many more candies with a $100 bill. And try to explain it to him, not interested, I just want the candies. And he would forgo the $100 bill. And that's something which it doesn't make sense. Someone whose sense, his chacham bin adas, are in place, are intact, right? It would say, obviously, give me the $100. That's the difference, the adult and the child. There's a certain short-circuitedness by the child, and again, based on the fact he doesn't have das, so therefore he's driven to stuff which ain't really love. So again, this is relative to something greater. Even if you want candy, you can get so many more candies with that $100 bill. It doesn't resonate with him or her. But there's also something they're driven to things on the onset which are trivial by the adult. Many of them these drives are negated by them because they have a healthy Chachma Bina Das. So again, what Alter Rebbe is trying to point out, that the Ava Kifi Das. The drive is based on your knowledge. Which tells us again, the Meichin are the Abba ve'ima, Lashon there also in Peri Gimel Koti Amar, of the Midas, which are Telas, they're offsprings, they're derivatives. They come as a result of my appreciation in the matter, one's appreciation in the matter. And then Alter Rebbe goes on the next line. From there, you have the buildup from Midas, you have Machshava, you start thinking about the matter. You emote, and after you emoting with the matter, you get connected on an emotional level, then you start thinking about it. So you see how Machshava comes directly from the experience, the thought kicks in from the experience of the Midas, of the way it is in your emotions. And as Alter Rebbe speaks about the Davar Sheheves, and this which is driven to, you start thinking about it. And again, the difference is thinking the way it's in thought and the way it's in the Midas. The Midas, there's no Isis, there's no letters, no words in Midas. That's why I have no words. Person emotes, you can see that there's no cap on that emotions. That's the whole point. It's free of any cap. Person expresses emotions. You don't see any structure to it, because that's what emotions are all about. How much more so when they're in the level of Chabad, there's certainly no Isis. Isis, letters, words, structure, begin in Machshava. For that matter, we think in languages as well. The Rebbe points this out in the 20th chapter of Likutei Amarim. You see towards the end of the 20th chapter of Likutei Amarim, he said that's where the Isis is the cap. In other words, a person thinks about something in a structured manner. And he says, thinks about this which it loves and also how to execute. He strategizes with Machshava. Now that I feel for the other party, I'm going to strategize something to alleviate the difficulty of the other experience of the other party. You're going through a difficult time, I'm going to strategize how I can help them, give them a loan, give them a piece of bread, invite them to my table, say how I could, the best words I could use to soothe their broken heart. That also is the machshava, how to realize, how to accomplish, how to actualize this kindness and this compassion, this mercy. And in every single thought, the energy of the thought is the midah, is that emotional experience, which is invested in that machshava, which brought the machshava to come about, to think. So it's the energy of it. This is the energy, this is the battery of the machshava. Like you have something, an electrical device, it doesn't function, you put the battery in, then it starts functioning. The battery of the machshava, of any thought, is the midah, which is right now pumping the energy to allow the machshava to develop. Then the Alter Rebbe goes on to the fourth step, which is from thought to speech. The speech, what is the energy of the speech? Is this which I think. If I don't think about something, I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about it because it's relevant to me. It was relevant to me in my thought, and then it comes to expression via speech. So the energy of the speech, the battery of the speech, is the Isis Machshava, is the thought process. From the Dibur, maybe the Maisa, Alter Rebbe goes on to the fifth level, which from speech it comes to action, which is the Maisa Tzedakah V'Chesed, speaking about kindness, my charitable acts, my implementation of kindness. Do I have to have the speech as a interface between thought and action? Not always. For that matter, sometimes better don't talk about it so much as do it. But nonetheless, there is the regular evolution from thought to speech to action. Sometimes you need the dibur as an interface between machshava and ma'isa, thought and action. He gives the example, like a king which dictates to his servants to give, to express the charity, to actualize, to implement rather the charity, to implement the kindness. So at that point, and like wherever there is like the hierarchy with a chain of command, so then the speech is crucial in order that the action should be implemented. And even in a case when someone does it himself, Like we said before, that not always is it crucial that you have the full expression of speech in order to implement the action. Not always. Sometimes it is, as we mentioned, that the words, calming and soothing words to a broken heart, makes a difference. Not only the actual giving, even though that's the ultimate satisfaction, alone, inviting someone to a meal, having him eat, preparing the food for them, going to the closet, taking out the bread, giving it to him, that's the ultimate satisfaction. But even in halacha, words, it says in halacha that one has to give the tzedakah b'sever panim yafis, with a proper and pleasant countenance, and words make a difference. Have a seat, make yourself comfortable. Every one of these expressions in the context of giving, in the context of expressing chesed, kindness, mercy, compassion, again, it worked with all midas. The other way, in the other side as well, gvura, discipline. But Alter Rebbe is speaking about kindness and compassion, and as such, he's following that pattern of Chabad midas and machshava dibur ma'isa, again with that pattern of chesed, and therefore sometimes the dibur is crucial in order the ma'isa should be performed, the actualization of ma'isa, like they give the example of the king, or like we mentioned in any type of chain of command system, but sometimes even someone who does it himself. Yes, words are certainly important even in this very evolution of machshava to dibur to ma'isa, when you actualize, when you implement kindness, but not always. Like we just said, there's sometimes a mirmat, masei harbe, do more, talk less. So sometimes you can do the entire action without talking at all. So where is the dibur in that evolution of the machshava dibur to ma'isa? So he says that in the end of the day, it is a gradual descend. In other words, there is the milmaila lamata from machshava to dibur to ma'isa, as he says, the koyach hanefesh v'chayusa mislavish b'siyazu ke'ayin mamash l'gabe koyach hanefesh v'chayusa mislavish b'dibur ha'adam. This soul energy, which invests in this action, is like nothing, literally translated, in comparison to the soul energy and vitality which invests in the speech of man. There's no comparison. So on the onset, there is obviously no comparison, because the whole virtue and the whole superiority of man over any other of Hashem's creation is the fact that he's able to talk. Vayi Adam lenefesh chaya, says the pasuk, says the Targum, leruach memalala, that his spirit was able to speak, and we don't need to look further. That is the advantage of man over any other Hashem's creation. So therefore, we could easily appreciate that the soul energy, you see more soul in speech over action. For that matter, an animal also has action. For that matter, the action of animal could be much greater than the action of man in pulling and pushing, and so they have much more energy, even though the action of man is more articulate, more refined, more sophisticated. But the concept of action exists with all in other creations. Speech doesn't. And again, we can appreciate on the most simplest level that speech is really where you see the soul energy, the refined soul energy, as opposed to action. But therefore, it's not only between the man, the human being, and other creations which also have action. Like we gave the example, the animal. For that matter, as we just mentioned, it has a certain potency, has a certain koyach, rather even more. But Rav was b'koyach shar, even more than man, but. And there but nonetheless, it's obvious that more this soul is much more evident in the human being, the fact, or via the fact that he's able to talk, and therefore it's not only in contrast of the animal and the human being, but within the human being itself, the dibur and the ma'isa, that there's so much more soul energy in dibur even over ma'isa, but it's much more than that. Because you're not only talking about the refined dimension of soul, the whole idea of speech, organized speech, eloquent speech, which is a step before the person puts his hands on, which is again the crossover from Elam Dibur to Elam Maisa, more refined, sublimated, plain, sublimated level. The person talking is a person crossing over to the line which he has hands on already. Maisa is hands on, and anybody can appreciate the dibur, the superiority of dibur as such, anybody can appreciate, it's easy to appreciate rather, the superiority of dibur over maisa. And when we say something is superior, higher, more elevated, that is another way of saying the soul, which is the elevated, in other words, the refined dimension of the soul energy. When we say soul energy, we realize it's a transcendent, superior energy, is invested in speech much more than in action. That's why the speech is on a higher plane, on a higher level. And he says, to the extent that the koyach of the nefesh, the soul energy which invests in Maisa, which it does, if not, the person wouldn't be able to do anything, particularly when it comes to the human being. Like we said before, human being is not only about pushing, pulling, kind of robotic acts, and the human dimension is also felt and expressed and manifest in action as well. A human being's action is very articulate, even within the same person. He could pull, even the pulling a table is different. It's more refined and more mechushban, more calculated. Every step of the human being is meant to be, and by so many is calculated, even when it comes to expressing oneself via maisa, via action. But also within the human being, maisa could be expressed in art, in someone that has the ability to draw, calligraphy, or nice handwriting. This is maisa, but then you see the sophistication, you see the total refinement of that maisa. But any level of maisa you can't compare, and therefore there's certainly a lot of soul energy. On the onset, the fact that the person is able to do anything, obviously it's because of his soul. Again, we're not talking about nefesh elikis, nefesh bahamis. In the end, it is the nefesh bahamis, nefesh achinas. We're talking about that the soul energy, which gives the ability of the person to function. So that ability is, again, it's a soul energy which invests in maisa. But beyond that, there is even, you see certain maisas which do express soul much more than other, even maisa, other actions, like we just mentioned. And the talent of drawing or other talents which a person is able to, a human being is able to express via his maisa, which any other creation cannot. Which there you certainly see the nefesh, a nafshi is a soul, a human soul type of expression. But how could you compare that to the soul energy which invested in speech? And he says, to the extent it's ke'ayin, it's mamish like nothing. Now he's not going into different levels of mice. I'm just adding that here. He's saying mice. You're doing the action of kindness in this context, which he's using that midah, that attribute of kindness, based on the person's appreciation. Again, it started with his cognitive faculties. As we mentioned before, it started with his Chabad, appreciating the matter, understanding, picking up the whole image, the matter which triggers his kindness. And so he triggers the emotion of kindness, and then he follows suit with thought, speech, and action. So here he's speaking about the thought, the speech, and action of kindness. So action would be just literally telling the person, here's your sandwich, you're hungry, or here's a loaf of bread, or even inviting someone to the table, and so on. Doing that, implementing, actualizing, realizing that chesed, that kindness. The speech is the which again, as we just mentioned, not always it's that crucial and essential that there is this speech in order to implement the chesed, the kindness, like we just gave the example. But nonetheless, one thing is clear, that the energy of the soul, as he says over here, is ke'ayin in Maisa, as in comparison to the way it is b'dibur. So we see over here this gradual the decline, if you will, not decline, but a degradation from machshava to dibur to Maisa. He says to the extent of the distance of the energy which is in the Maisa, the way the energy is in the dibur, is like this euphemism of the comparison of body to soul. Now, body to soul works in unison. There's a healthy person, or any healthy creation is when there is a total fusion of body and soul. When you look at the body, you see it's a levedike guf, it's a live body, because every part of the body is infused with the energy of the soul, granted. But nonetheless, this is body and that's soul. And when you see soul life in the body, is because of the soul, and you cannot compare the body in its own to the soul. He says that similarly, the energy which is in mais in comparison to the energy which is in dibur is like ke'erach haguf l'neshama. And then he goes on again, mamata l'mayla, the higher level, erech ha'isa dibur l'isa machshava. The comparison of the energy of the soul which is invested in letters of speech to the letters of machshava, of thought. We do understand and appreciate immediately the difference. We don't have to explain much over here. Rather, the energy of the soul in thought is so much more evident than the energy of the soul in speech. It's so simple because, as we gave the example, sometimes you think about something for 2 minutes and it could take you 2 hours to utter, to verbalize this same matter with speech. Why so? Why is it working so much quicker? You can't say there is no Isis in Machshava. There is Isis in Machshava, like we said before, to the extent people think in languages. So there is a whole structure of Isis within Machshava, but nonetheless, you see so much soul energy, meaning it's a limitless energy in Machshava, as much as in comparison, it's not truly limitless, but in comparison to the Isis of Dibur, there it's much more confined, and there, thus the comparison, even in time, you can think something thoroughly in 2 minutes, and it take you maybe perhaps a few hours to utter, in other words, verbalize this whole message in words and speech. Because again, the soul energy in Machshava is way deeper, way more evident, much more manifest in thought than in speech. And he says in the same way, it's ke'ayin. It's also it's. He said v'chein means to say that even doesn't repeat the word ke'ayin. He says v'chein erech. One would perhaps suggest Alter Rebbe is saying also this is ke'ayin. It's so minimal in comparison to the soul energy, which is in Ma'aseh Machshava. And also perhaps you could add, similar to the Guf of the Neshama, because Alter Rebbe says V'chein, even though again he doesn't repeat the Guf of Neshama. Why would he need to? He's writing V'chein, and so to V'chein so to the Ma'aseh Machshava. In comparison to the midah, to the attribute which is invested in it, and it gives it life. Again, this is its energy. We explained before. You have an electrical device, it could be perfect with with different opportunities in this one device, but nonetheless, if there's no battery, there's no electricity coming through it, it's just not working. There needs to be the energy to make it function. So the previous level is the energy of the subsequent level. The Chabad is the energy of the Midas, and the Midas is the energy of the Machshava. When the Midah is reduced, the person stops thinking about it. It's when the midah is alive, the machshava would kick in, and so to the machshava, the thought is the energy of the speech. You're thinking about something, that's the energy of the speech. In other words, you're articulating the matter via speech, verbally articulating the matters, because the battery of machshava right now is invested in dibur, and so too your following suit with action is because the energy of the dibur is invested in that ma'aseh, is the energy of the ma'aseh. So too, he goes back to the midah. He says the energy of the machshava is the midah, and you cannot compare the isis of the machshava to the mahus of the midah, which is invested in it, which is giving life. You can't compare. Now, one of the simple ways to understand this, first of all, as we said in machshava, there are isis. There isis come to play within machshava. Again, we mentioned then, you could see it in Perek Chaf. You can also see on this side, Perek Chaf, towards the end of Perek Chaf in Likutei Amarim. Not in Shaykh B'Munah. Shaykh B'Munah only has 12 chapters. And the end of Perek Chaf in Likutei Amarim, Isis come to play in Machshava. Pre-Machshava, before thought. In Midas, there's not even Isis, like we mentioned before. That's the whole point of a Midah. A person gets emotional. There's nothing confining that emotion by definition of what it is. There's no Isis, there's no cap. Therefore, when someone says, I have no words, and they can express themselves in a way that you see that there is no limitation of the expression of this midah, because by definition, within the structure of midah, there are no Isis. There's no Isis. Isis commence by machshava. So you cannot compare the soul energy with the machshava to the soul energy which is in the midah. Also similar ke'ayin mamash, and similar to the guf and the neshama. That's the distance between the two. Similarly over here, as Alter Rebbe says, v'chein, and also here, v'chein erech mus v'chayis hamidah l'gab ha'chachma bina v'das v'sheklo lusana seichel shemimenen nimshcha midazu. And so too, finally, l'mata l'mayla, the midas in comparison to seichel. And again, we don't have to explain the intellect of the human being. That's what also, for that matter, the Alter Rebbe writes in Ger Sakej, I think we did mention before, the connection, the line, the thread which comes from the intellect of the human being to his speech, particularly Chochma, famous Igeres HaKodesh, towards the beginning, one of the original Igres epistles of the Alter Rebbe in Igeres HaKodesh, he speaks about this idea. It's actually in Perik Hey Igeres HaKodesh, the connection between the Chochma of the human being and the ability to speak rather. But in this context, we need not to look further. The intellectual dimension of the creation, called the human being, that's its superiority over all creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The mightiest, the most dominant in the world of Chayas and Behemoths, the animal kingdom. Man has that virtue of seichel, the ability to intellectualize. And as such, the whole power of intellect, the whole gift of intellect is a soul expression, a soul of the human being expression. And you cannot compare the soul energy, which is so manifest and so obvious in the cognitive faculties of the human being, which again, klalus in general, you're talking about the intellectual capacity of the human being in comparison to the midah. For that matter, even you contrast the human being and even the animal has emotions. It's default by them. They can have emotions, especially if they're their offsprings. They do have the ability and they do express themselves emotionally. They certainly do. Intellect they don't have. The intellect of the human being, within the human being itself, even though again, the human being's midas, some are more refined, certainly more refined and sublimated and delicate, more than the animal by default, but nonetheless, you cannot compare the midas to the seichel, to the intellect of the human being, which as such we can appreciate that the soul energy, the sublime soul, its energy and the cognitive faculties are so much higher, greater, deeper than they are and express themselves in midas, in character attribute of man, which again, that is the seichel being the chayas, the energy of that midah. It allowed the midah to come into place at the onset, because the whole phenomenon of midas is that you appreciate something intellectually, that it develops, that ignites, that establishes a midah, a drive. It depends, whatever the midah would be produced, if it's ava, yira, love, fear, compassion, and so on, it's produced. That is called toldis, as we just spoke and mentioned. It's called the offspring. It's produced through a thorough understanding and appreciation of any matter. And if the matter is about love, the midah is born, the midah is produced, and as such, it remains the chayas, the vitality, the battery of that very midah. But you can't compare the soul energy in this seichel the way the soul energy is in the midah. Understandably so. And he says, concludes this chapter, this is all in soul of man, and the soul of all creation, in the supreme world, all worlds, in the supreme worlds and inferior worlds, and all the chokhmah is the beginning and the source of life. The end of the page with the text. But what is Alter Rebbe saying over here? All Beruim, all Eilamis, Elyenim et. Do we find it in the animal, for example, all these 5 levels? The answer is obviously not. The animal doesn't have an intellect, and the animal doesn't have speech. It has some understanding. It does have some understanding. It knows its owners, it knows its domain, its turf, its barn, the barn when it's time to eat, and so on and so forth. Even though it's the hunger which is triggering the eating process, but nonetheless, it has some understanding. But you can't come say this is seichel. This is truly understanding, appreciating of a matter. The animal doesn't have it. Speech it certainly doesn't have. So what does it mean? What else in all the bruim of the tachtainim? So certainly the Alter Rebbe is talking about the tachtainim, all types of human beings. And even within other creation, perhaps they don't have those two, but nonetheless, there is something which is gradual, exists by them. They, for example, emote when they have, even an animal, see something and appreciate something to a certain level and a certain degree, which arouses their emotions. Someone's hurting, they see a scenario that their children, the actual children, as an example, their offsprings, are compromised, so they see it, they capture the idea. They ultimately can establish this emotion. They emote based on what they understood and they perceived. So there is that process also in other bruim. Do they have clarity? Do they have that clarity the human being has? That intellectual capacity? Obviously not. Does it have speech? Certainly not. But nonetheless, it all begins from the higher level, and it goes ahead from one level to the other. Even again, not everyone has all five. And then the Alter Rebbe speaks about the Eilemis Elyonim. There's Malachim, there's Neshamas, and if you think about it, even the Eilemis themselves, they have these 10 spheres, as we spoke about so many times. In every Eilim, there's the 10 spheres: Chachma, Bina, Das, Netzach, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod Yisod, Malchus. Malchus corresponding to the Machshava Dibur Maisa, as an example, the way it is by the human being. And the reason why it's by the human being, because Nishtal Shlumehen, as we spoke so many times, and that Nikuda, the reason why all this exists, this whole structure exists by the human being, is because it's a manifestation, it's an evolvement of the way it's on high. So on the Eilemis themselves, you have the 10 spheres. What is the highest sphere in all these 10 spheres? Is obviously Chochmah. Chochmah is Reishis. And then from there, everything gradually evolves. Here the Alter Rebbe is going to say in the next chapter, Perik Tes Bez Hashem, we look forward to continuing next week. But the Gabi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Chachma, the high, is the way it is in our system, and the system in all Eilemis, even Elyonim. By HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the highest, which is Chachma, is Kulam Chachma Asisa, is the lowest of the five, is Asiya. This is one of the ways Alter Rebbe touches Kulam Chachma Asisa, as we spoke about it before. And then the Alter Rebbe makes it very clear. It's not, and so that itself tells us, whoa, Hashem thinks the whole system of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so much different. Way different. Don't try to make sense. Don't try to establish your workings based on, or Hashem's working based on your workings, the way things develop and function by you. No, by us as human beings. And in every level, the Alter Rebbe says, Kol Eilemis Elyonim v'Tachtenim, the Chachma is the Reishis, by the Eibishter, it's the lowest. So there's inner workings which are way beyond the inner workings of creation, all levels of creation. And the Alter Rebbe makes it clear, it's not five. Even 5 levels would tell us how transcendent HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. But Alter Rebbe says it's understandably beyond 5. How many levels higher is HaKadosh Baruch Hu than things they are in the Bria? It's really, the Alter Rebbe starts with Revavis Madreges, and he says Ein Ketz, Ad Ein Ketz. There's no level to say there's 5, there's 10, there's 10,000. Hashem's inner workings are 10,000 notches over hours or of creation. That's a lot, and that itself tells us, whoa, this is a different phenomenon. We start over here, the Hashem is 10,000 levels higher, his inner workings. So that's why it's to say that I understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What do we understand? How can we understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I believe we mentioned it earlier, the expression of the Rebbe, that when you do understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's a chidush, that's a novelty. How could all the way up there connect with this which is by definition inferior to the Hashem's inner workings? And that's what the Alter Rebbe says, it's not only 10,000, it's Ad Ein Ketz, there is no limit. So it's not 5, it's not 10, it's not 10,000, it's Ad Ein Ketz. As the Alter Rebbe's message, Perik Tes, as he begins, Aval Gabei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And with this, the Alter Rebbe is saying that now we could put things in perspective, that this message which the Alter Rebbe has in the beginning of Perik Ches, based on the Rambam, Ve'il Hashem, Mahusi Vatzmusi V'daitei, V'dovar HaYedur, it's all one, and we can't appreciate it by us, because it's a composite of 3 things. Every expression of the human being, it's my soul invested in my compassion, and then this which I have compassion to. And so to my knowledge, it's me, my gift of knowledge, and this which I get to know. And eventually a lot of stuff which we know really become part and parcel of who we are. Like we mentioned the other day, 2 + 2 is 4. It's something kind of knowing it thoroughly, and from the youngest of age, it becomes part of our hard drive, if you will. You can see that oneness, but nonetheless, it's a oneness of it's a composite. It's a combination of different factors coming together. The human being, his knowledge, and again, we elaborated on this. This is again the famous Rambam. The Rambam speaks about Alter Rebbe speaks about it quite a few times in Shari Yechem itself, in Kuti Amarim also. In the 2nd chapter, and we're learning now the 4th chapter, it brings us as well. But in this context, Alter Rebbe in Shari Yechem in the context of oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he brings it a few times, and here he elaborates on this, and he says, no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no Achdus Murkeves. There's no composite of 3 things coming together the way it is by a human being. by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's all one, based on the proof of the Rambam, which the Alter Rebbe elucidates. As we spoke again, it's a click away. You can see the first two classes. So therefore, we cannot say, well, by me it works differently. How is it by Hashem? It works so distinct and so different, and to stark contrast the way it works by a human being. So Alter Rebbe says, yeah, this is the end of this Perek Ches, and beginning of Perek Tes. The whole system by a human being is so distinct than the way it is lahavdil by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the highest levels by us is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Asisa, the lowest. And again, beyond that, not 5 levels, but beyond that, not 5, not 5,000, but again, Adin Ketz. Have a wonderful night.